I haven't touched my piano in 18 years. Not since the night my son Ryan called me from the airport, played me the opening bars of the concerto he'd written for me, and said, "Tomorrow, Mom, Carnegie Hall." Tomorrow never came. His plane crashed into the mountains and they told me he burned alive. But last night, a stranger left a recording on my porch. I pressed play and heard a piano. That melody. His melody. The one that died with him. Except this version had an ending he never finished. And when I decoded the notes the way only Ryan and I could, they spelled out coordinates. My son has been alive this whole time. And someone has been keeping him in a cage. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. Or rather, let me start with the silence. Because that's what my life has been for 18 years. One long, unbearable silence where music used to live. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm 65 years old, and I live alone in a Victorian house on Abercorn Street in Savannah, Georgia. The house has 14 rooms, which is 13 too many for a woman whose family has been reduced to photographs and ghosts. My husband James died of a heart attack 20 years ago, 2 years before Ryan. The doctor said it was sudden, painless. They always say that. As if the word painless means anything to the person left standing in the hallway, holding a cup of coffee that's gone cold, wondering how the world can keep spinning when the center of it just stopped. After James, it was just Ryan and me, my boy. My brilliant, stubborn, impossibly talented boy. He could play Chopin by the time he was 6, not the simplified versions they give to children, but the real nocturnes, the ones that make grown men cry in concert halls. His fingers were too small to reach the octaves, so he invented his own fingerings, workarounds that his teachers said were technically wrong but sounded absolutely right. That was Ryan. He never did anything the conventional way, but the result was always something you couldn't look away from. I was a music teacher at Savannah Arts Academy for 32 years. I taught hundreds of students how to read notes, keep time, find the melody buried inside a difficult passage. But Ryan was different from all of them. He didn't just play music, he spoke it. When he sat at the piano, the instrument became an extension of his body, his breath, his heartbeat. I used to watch him practice from the doorway of the music room, this room that I haven't opened in 18 years, and feel something that went beyond pride. It was recognition, like looking into a mirror that reflected not my face, but my soul. When he was 10 years old, we invented something together. A secret language made of notes. It started as a game on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Ryan was bored with his scales, and I suggested we create a code. Each note corresponded to a letter. A was A, obviously. B flat was B. C sharp was C. We built an entire alphabet, refined it over months until we could write messages to each other in musical notation. He would leave little compositions on the kitchen table. I would decode them over coffee. Things like, "Can we have pizza tonight?" Or, "I got an A on my history test." Silly things. Beautiful things. The kind of things you don't realize are precious until they're gone. The piano room sits at the end of the first-floor hallway. It has tall windows that face the garden. And in the mornings, the light comes through the old glass in a way that makes everything look like it's underwater. There's a Steinway Grand in there, a 1962 Model B that James bought me for our 10th anniversary. It cost more than our car. I told him he was insane. He told me some things were worth being insane for. Ryan played his first real piece on that piano. Shark's Lullaby, age 4, his tiny feet dangling off the bench because they couldn't reach the pedals. I recorded it on a cassette tape that I still have in my nightstand drawer. After Ryan died, I closed that room. I pulled the door shut and I locked it, and I put the key in a box on the top shelf of my bedroom closet. I haven't opened it since. Sometimes, late at night, I walk down the hallway and stop in front of that door. I press my palm against the wood, and I can almost hear it. The ghost of a melody. The echo of small hands learning to find their way across black and white keys. But I don't open the door. because opening it would mean admitting that the music stopped. And some part of me, some irrational, desperate part, still believes that if I keep it sealed, the music is still in there, waiting, preserved, like a letter you never send because sending it would make the goodbye real. Every night, for 18 years, I have followed the same ritual. I sit in the armchair by the window in my bedroom. I put on my headphones, and I press play on the last recording Ryan ever sent me. It was an email, sent from his phone at the airport the night before his flight. The subject line said, "For you, Mom. Listen to the end." The attachment was a recording of him playing the concerto he'd written for me. His senior thesis at Juilliard, the piece that earned him the invitation to Carnegie Hall. 4 movements. 22 minutes. I know every note. The way I know my own pulse. The way his tempo shifts in the second movement. Just slightly. Like a held breath. The way he lingers on a particular chord in the third. A chord that always reminded me of the way sunlight looks when it breaks through rain clouds. He called me that night. After sending it, I remember exactly what I was doing, standing at the kitchen sink, washing the dinner dishes, looking out at the garden where the magnolias were dropping their last petals. The phone rang, and his voice filled the room, electric with excitement. "Mom, did you listen to it yet?" "I'm saving it for tonight," I told him. "My special bedtime concert." He laughed. That laugh, full and warm and completely unself-conscious. "You're going to love the ending," he said. "I finally figured it out. It took me 3 but I finally know how it's supposed to end." I smiled, drying my hands on the dish towel. "I can't wait to hear it." His voice softened then, the way it always did when he was about to say something real. "Tomorrow, Mom. Carnegie Hall. I'm going to walk out on that stage and play this piece, and the whole world is going to hear what I wrote for you. Everything I am. Everything I know about music. It started with you. At that piano. In that room." I pressed the phone against my ear and closed my eyes. "Ryan," I whispered. "Just come home safe. Tomorrow, Mom." He said again, and I could hear the grin in his voice. Tomorrow changes everything. He was right about that. Tomorrow did change everything. Just not the way either of us imagined. The phone call came at 11:43 on an October night. I know the exact time because the kitchen clock stopped working that evening, frozen at 11:43, and I never fixed it. It still reads 11:43 today. Some clocks aren't meant to move forward. I had just finished listening to Ryan's recording for the first time. I was sitting in the armchair with my eyes closed, the last notes of the concerto still resonating in my chest, when the doorbell rang. Not the phone. The doorbell. That distinction matters because no one rings your doorbell at 11:43 at night unless something has gone terribly wrong. 2 police officers stood on my porch. A man and a woman, both young enough to be my students. The woman had been crying. The man did the talking. He'd rehearsed it. I could hear the careful spacing between his words, the deliberate neutrality designed to hold together a world he was about to shatter. There had been an accident. A small charter plane flying from Savannah to New York. It went down in the Appalachian Mountains during heavy fog, struck a ridge, and exploded on impact. The pilot and the sole passenger were both killed. The passenger's identification matched Ryan James Sullivan, age 24. I remember the porch light flickering. I remember the sound of crickets, impossibly loud, as if the whole world had gone quiet except for them. I remember the female officer reaching for my arm as my knees buckled, and I remember thinking, with strange clinical detachment, that the magnolia petals on the ground looked like confetti, like someone was celebrating. They drove me to the county morgue. The hallway smelled of chemicals that burned the inside of my nose. A man in a white coat met me outside a metal door with kind eyes behind round glasses. "Mrs. Sullivan, the remains sustained catastrophic damage. The fire was extensive. We won't be able to do a visual identification." They showed me what they'd recovered. A wristwatch. The Omega Seamaster James had given Ryan for his 21st birthday. The crystal cracked, but the inscription still legible. To Ryan, who always keeps perfect time. Love, Dad, and a ring. A simple silver band with 4 notes engraved on the inside. C, E, G, B. The first 4 notes of the concerto. I'd had it made for Ryan when he was accepted to Juilliard. He never took it off. I held the ring in my palm. So small. So impossibly light for something that was supposed to represent an entire life. The metal was still warm. Or maybe I needed it to be warm because everything else in that building was so unbearably cold. Is this your son's ring? Mrs. Sullivan. I nodded. I couldn't speak. Speaking would have made it real. We buried Ryan on a Thursday. It rained. Because of course it rained. The slow, steady, gray kind that soaks through your coat and settles into your bones like it plans to stay forever. Bonaventure Cemetery, just east of Savannah, where the live oaks drip with Spanish moss and the graves are so old, some names have been worn smooth by centuries of weather. James was already there, under a magnolia tree. We put Ryan next to him, standing at the grave, watching them lower the casket. Something bothered me, a small thing, barely conscious, the kind of detail your mind registers, but files away because the grief is too loud for anything else to be heard. The casket felt light. When the pallbearers carried it from the hearse, they moved too easily. No strain in their shoulders. No careful adjustment of weight. I'd carried enough furniture in my life to know what weight looked like in a man's arms, and what I saw that day didn't look right. But I said nothing. What was I going to say? I was a woman standing in the rain, burying her only child. I was not in a position to question physics. After the funeral, I drove home. Walked through the front door, down the hallway, and stopped in front of the piano room. I stood there for a long time. Then I closed the door, locked it, and put the key in a box on the top shelf of my closet. That was 18 years ago. 18 years. I've lived more of my life without Ryan than I lived with him. That thought arrives every morning like a bill I can never pay. I eat alone. I tend the garden alone. I tutor 4 private students because the silence in this house would kill me if I let it. And every night, I sit in my armchair, put on my headphones, and listen to Ryan's concerto. 22 minutes. 4 movements. The only voice left in my life that matters. Tonight was the 18th anniversary. I followed my ritual exactly. Armchair. Headphones. Play. I closed my eyes and let the music carry me to the place where Ryan still exists. Where tomorrow is still coming and Carnegie Hall is still waiting. The recording ended. Silence rushed in. I sat in the dark, breathing, enduring. The clock read 11:43 because it always reads 11:43. And then the doorbell rang. I checked my phone. 11:07 in the evening. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I opened the door carefully. The street was quiet, oaks casting long shadows under the streetlights. And there, on the welcome mat, sat a small package wrapped in brown paper. No name, no return address, no postmark. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table. My hands were steady as I peeled back the paper. Inside was a USB drive, black, unremarkable. Beside it, a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, written by a hand that hadn't held a pen steadily in a very long time. But I knew that handwriting. I knew it the way I knew the concerto. The way I knew the weight of Ryan's ring in my palm. The way I knew the sound of his laugh and the exact pressure of his fingers on piano keys. The note said 2 sentences. Play this. Then listen to the ending. I stood in my kitchen, holding a dead man's handwriting, and felt the floor shift beneath my feet. My whole body began to shake. Because handwriting doesn't survive plane crashes. Handwriting doesn't climb out of graves. Handwriting doesn't appear on your doorstep 18 years after you buried it in the ground. Unless it was never in the ground at all. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I carried the USB drive to the living room like it was made of glass, set my laptop on the coffee table, and plugged it in with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. The screen glowed blue in the dark house. A single audio file appeared. No title, no metadata, just a file named 0715, which meant nothing to me then. It would mean everything later. I put on my headphones and pressed play. Piano. The first notes hit me like a physical blow. The concerto. Ryan's concerto. The one he wrote for me. The one I'd listened to every night for 18 years. But this was not the recording from the airport. This was different. The tempo was slower, heavier, as if the pianist were carrying something enormous on his shoulders, and each note cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. The touch was deeper, more deliberate, less joy, more gravity, like the same words spoken by someone who had aged decades between sentences. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, analyzing the way only a music teacher can. The phrasing in the first movement was almost identical to Ryan's, but the dynamic range had shifted. Where Ryan used to soar, this version ached. Where he used to play with lightness, this version pressed into the keys, like a man trying to hold on to something slipping away. And the acoustic environment was wrong. Ryan's airport recording had the ambient hum of a practice room, warm and padded. This recording echoed. Hard surfaces, concrete or stone. A room that wasn't designed for music. A room that was designed for something else. Entirely. The second movement passed. The third. I knew every measure, every rest, every breath between phrases. My body tensed as the fourth movement approached its final passage. The place where Ryan's version always stopped. The unfinished ending. 3 years he'd worked on it, and he never found the resolution. The piece simply faded, trailing off into silence like a question without an answer. But this time the music didn't stop. The fourth movement reached that familiar edge, that precipice where the melody always dissolved. And then it kept going. New notes, new harmonies, a continuation that had never existed before. 3 minutes of music I had never heard, composed by hands that knew this concerto from the inside out, that understood its architecture the way only its creator could. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Because this wasn't an arrangement. This wasn't someone else's interpretation. This was the ending. The real ending. The one Ryan told me he'd finally figured out. The one he was going to play at Carnegie Hall. The one that died with him. Except it hadn't died. Someone was playing it. Someone who knew how it was supposed to end. The new section built to a crescendo, then softened into a passage so quiet I had to close my eyes to hear it properly. And that's when the pattern emerged. A sequence of notes that didn't belong to the melody. They were woven into the final measures like a thread of different color stitched into fabric. Subtle, almost invisible, unless you knew what to look for. Unless you'd invented the code yourself on a rainy Sunday afternoon with your 10-year-old son. My hands moved on their own. I grabbed a pen in the back of an envelope and began transcribing. Note by note. Letter by letter. The old alphabet we'd built together. The one that turned music into language and language back into music. C sharp. A. G sharp. The letters formed slowly, my handwriting shaking worse than the note on the doorstep. The first word was Mom. I stopped breathing. The second word was I'm. The third was alive. Mom. I'm alive. They won't let me leave. Then, numbers. A string of notes that translated not into letters, but into digits, coordinates, latitude and longitude, encoded in the musical language that only 2 people on Earth had ever spoken. I typed the coordinates into my laptop with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. The map loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, zooming in from the curve of the eastern seaboard to the green ridges of Vermont, past Burlington, past Montpelier, deep into the Green Mountains where the roads thin to lines and the towns disappear. The pin dropped on a patch of forest. No town name, no street address. Just acres of unbroken green and a single structure, visible from satellite. A large building, institutional in shape, with a long driveway and what appeared to be a fence around the perimeter. I zoomed in further. On the roof, barely visible, an antenna array. And on the front facade, small enough that I had to squint, a sign, Ashford Retreat. A sanctuary for artists seeking creative renewal. Ashford. I said the name out loud in my empty living room, and it tasted like poison. Gregory Ashford. I hadn't spoken that name in 17 years. Not since the afternoon I was washing dishes and heard Ryan's concerto playing on the kitchen radio, performed by someone named Victor Sorin, credited as the composer. I smashed that radio against the counter so hard the pieces scattered across the floor like broken teeth. Then I swept them up, threw them away, and never listened to the radio again. Ryan had told me about Ashford. 6 months before the crash, he'd called me, furious and frightened. He stole it, Mom. My concerto. He registered it under Sorin's name. He's going to release it as Sorin's work. I'd urged him to get a lawyer, to fight back. He said he had. He said he had evidence. He said Carnegie Hall was going to be his proof, his platform, his moment to show the world the truth. He never made it to that stage. And now, 18 years later, his music was telling me exactly where he was, locked inside a building owned by the man who stole his work. A man who hadn't just stolen a concerto. He'd stolen my son. I stared at the satellite image, at that building hidden in the mountains, and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not grief. I'd lived with grief for 18 years. This was different. This was older and sharper and infinitely more dangerous. This was rage. Gregory Ashford. I need to tell you about him. Because understanding what he did to my son means understanding the kind of man who smiles while he dismantles your life. Ryan met Ashford at a showcase event during his final year at Juilliard. Ashford Productions was the biggest name in classical music management, representing over 40 artists worldwide, and Gregory Ashford himself had a reputation for discovering young talent. He was charming, magnetic, the kind of man who made you feel like the most important person in the room simply by looking at you. He wore hand-tailored suits and spoke about music with genuine passion, and when he told Ryan that his concerto was the most original composition he'd heard in 20 years, my son believed him. I believed him too. The contract came 3 weeks later. Exclusive representation. Recording deal. A European tour planned for the following spring. Ryan called me that night, breathless with excitement. Mom, this is it. This is how it happens. Ashford is going to make the whole world hear my music. For 6 months, everything seemed perfect. Ryan moved into a studio apartment in Manhattan that Ashford's company provided. He recorded demos, attended industry events, networked with conductors and festival directors. He was living the life he'd dreamed about since he was 4 years old, sitting on a piano bench with his feet dangling above the pedals. Then in March, 7 months before the crash, Ryan called me at 2 a.m. His voice was different, tight, controlled. The voice of someone trying very hard not to scream. Mom. He registered my concerto under Victor Sorin's name. The whole thing. All 4 movements. He filed the copyright 6 weeks ago. It's in Sorin's name. Published by Ashford Music Group. My concerto, Mom. The one I wrote for you. Victor Sorin was Ashford's flagship artist. A Norwegian pianist with sharp cheekbones and a mysterious public persona. The kind of musician who sells albums based on mystique as much as talent. He had released 3 critically acclaimed recordings, all through Ashford's label. I told Ryan to get a lawyer immediately. He said he already had one. A music industry attorney named Patricia Wells, who'd agreed to take the case. She was gathering evidence, building a timeline of creation that would prove Ryan composed the concerto years before Sorin ever performed it. Ryan's Juilliard thesis, his professor's records, the early demo recordings. My own testimony about watching him compose it at our kitchen piano when he was 16. But Ashford found out about the lawyer. Ryan called me again, late April. And this time his voice wasn't controlled. It was afraid. He threatened me, Mom. He said if I pursue this, my career is finished. He said he has connections in every major orchestra, every festival, every recording studio in the world. He said no one will believe a 24-year-old nobody over Gregory Ashford. He said people who cross him tend to disappear. That word, disappear. I didn't understand its weight then. I thought it was a figure of speech, a rich man's bluster. I told Ryan to keep his head down, let the lawyer do her work, and focus on Carnegie Hall. The debut performance was scheduled for October. Ryan planned to play the concerto live on national broadcast and announce publicly that it was his composition, his name, his music, his proof. He was so certain it would work. I can still hear the determination in his voice. Once the world hears me play it, Mom, they'll know. You can't fake that connection. The music will tell the truth. The music did tell the truth. 18 years later, encoded in a secret language from a concrete room in the mountains of Vermont. But it told it to me alone. I spent the rest of that night on my laptop, digging into Gregory Ashford's world. What I found made my hands go cold. Ashford Productions had evolved since Ryan's time. It was now Ashford Entertainment Group, a conglomerate worth an estimated $1.7 billion. Music labels, film production, talent management, real estate. And nestled in the real estate portfolio Hands were shaking. He described the piano that was brought to room 7 on the 4th day, an old upright with a cracked soundboard and 2 dead keys. He described playing it because there was nothing else, because the music was the only thing the drugs could not dissolve, because every time he played the concerto, he could feel something at the edge of his memory, a warmth, a voice, a pair of hands playing beside his, that he could not name but refused to release. He described the monthly visits. Gregory Ashford sitting in the corner chair, listening, collecting manuscript pages, leaving without a word. He described the moment he realized his compositions were being performed by someone else, when he heard a fragment of his own melody playing from a radio in the hallway outside his room. He had pressed his ear to the door and listened to his own music being introduced under a name he did not recognize. He described the day he decided to fight back. The day he began encoding messages into his compositions using the secret alphabet he and his mother had invented when he was 10. 4 notes for each letter. Hidden inside the melody, invisible to anyone who did not know where to listen, he had written dozens of messages over the years. Most of them went nowhere. But the last one, the concerto's hidden 4th movement, was different. He had written it knowing that if it ever reached the right ears, everything would change. "I wrote it for my mother," Ryan said. His voice did not break, because she was the only person in the world who could read it. The courtroom was silent. Claire Dunham let the silence hold for 10 full seconds before she said, "No further questions." The defense mounted what could generously be called an effort. Ashford's attorney argued that his client was a patron of the arts who had provided housing and medical care to a troubled young man, that Ryan Sullivan had been a voluntary resident, that the compositions were collaborative works, that the flight records were inconclusive, that the medical logs could have been fabricated. Agent Whitfield's team dismantled each argument with the methodical patience of people who had been building this case for weeks, with evidence that spanned 18 years. The airport footage, the ghost pilot whose identity matched a former military contractor on Ashford's payroll, the empty coffin with the fake ring inscribed C-E-G-A instead of C-E-G-B, Tom Bradley's testimony about the van and the envelope, Alex Mercer's voice recording confirming conditions inside the facility, Elena Reyes's medical logs with timestamps that corresponded exactly to Ryan's testimony, and the manuscript pages, dozens of them, recovered from Ashford's private office, one bearing Ryan Sullivan's handwriting, authenticated by 3 independent forensic analysts. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 11 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Gregory Ashford was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The Ashford Entertainment Group was dissolved by court order, its assets seized and placed in a restitution fund for the victims' families. The Ashford Retreat was shut down, its records turned over to a federal task force investigating similar facilities across the country. I sat in that courtroom and listened to the verdict and felt something I had not expected. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was exhaustion. The deep bone-level exhaustion of a woman who had spent 18 years grieving a son who was alive and 3 weeks fighting to bring him home. Justice had been served. The law had spoken. The doors of room 7 would never close again. But as I watched Gregory Ashford being led away in handcuffs, I understood something that no verdict could change. The law could punish what had been done. It could not return what had been taken. 18 years of Ryan's life. 18 years of Sophie growing up without her father. 18 years of silence in a house where a piano gathered dust behind a locked door. No sentence could give those years back. I stood up, walked out of the courthouse into the November air, and found Ryan and Sophie sitting together on a bench beside the parking lot. They were not speaking. They were not touching. They were simply sitting side by side. 2 people learning how to exist in the same world, staring at the same gray sky, breathing the same cold air. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The first thing I did when we returned to Savannah was open the piano room. I had not turned that doorknob in 18 years. The key was still in the small wooden box on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, exactly where I had placed it the day after Ryan's funeral. I stood in front of the door for a long time, holding the key in my palm, feeling its weight. It was a small brass key, the kind that fits old interior doors in houses built before the war. It weighed almost nothing, but for 18 years it had been the heaviest object in my home. Ryan stood behind me in the hallway. Sophie stood beside him. Diana leaned against the far wall with her arms crossed, watching. No one spoke. No one needed to. They understood that this moment belonged to the silence between a mother and a locked door, and the years that had accumulated behind it like dust. I turned the key. The lock clicked. I pushed the door open. The room was exactly as I had left it. The curtains were drawn. The air smelled of old wood and stillness, and the faint ghost of lemon polish I had used the last time I cleaned the keys. 18 years of undisturbed quiet had given the room a weight, a density, as though time itself had settled into the corners and refused to leave. A thin layer of dust covered everything. The bookshelves, the music stand, the metronome on the side table, frozen at 120 beats per minute, the tempo of the concerto's second movement, and the piano. The old Steinway upright that James had bought me when we were first married. The piano where I had taught Ryan his first notes, where he had sat on my lap at 4 years old and pressed a single key and laughed at the sound it made. The fallboard was closed. The bench was pushed in. A faded photograph sat on top of the piano in a silver frame. Ryan at 16. The day he finished writing the concerto, grinning at the camera with a pencil behind his ear and manuscript papers scattered across the floor. I heard Ryan step into the room behind me. His footsteps were slow, careful, as though he were walking into a church. He moved past me and stood in front of the piano. He stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he reached out and touched the silver frame with the tips of his fingers. Gently, the way you touch something you are not sure is real. I remember this, he said quietly. I remember this room. He sat down on the bench. He lifted the fallboard. The keys were yellowed with age, but still intact, still waiting. He placed his hands on them and did not play. He simply rested his fingers against the ivory and closed his eyes, and I watched his shoulders rise and fall with a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. Then he played. Not the concerto. Not any piece I recognized. He played something new, something slow and searching and fragile, like a conversation between a man and an instrument that had been waiting for him to come home. The notes filled the room and pushed the dust from the air and the silence from the walls, and the house that had been a museum of grief for 18 years began to breathe again. Sophie sat on the floor beside the bench, with her back against the wall, and listened. She pulled her knees to her chest and rested her chin on them and closed her eyes, and I saw her lips move slightly, as though she were counting the beats the way I had taught my students to do when they were learning to feel the rhythm rather than just hear it. She did not know I was watching. She did not know that in that moment she looked exactly like Ryan at 16, sitting on the floor of this same room, counting beats, learning to trust the music. I sat in the armchair by the window, the same armchair where I had spent 18 years listening to a recording. But now the music was not coming from headphones. It was coming from the piano, from my son's hands, from the room I had locked because I believed the music had died. It had not died. It had been waiting. We stayed in that room for the rest of the afternoon. Ryan played. Sophie listened. I watched them both, and felt something I had not felt in so long that I had forgotten its name. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was not happiness. Happiness is too simple a word for what happens when the dead come home and the silence breaks and the locked doors finally open. It was wholeness. The feeling of a fractured thing becoming complete. In the weeks that followed, the house began to change. Sophie moved into the guest room upstairs and enrolled in the Savannah College of Art and Design to study music composition. Ryan started physical therapy to rebuild the muscle mass he had lost during 18 years of confinement. He walked every morning along the river, slowly at first, then farther, then faster, until one day I looked out the kitchen window and saw him jogging beneath the live oaks with Spanish moss brushing his shoulders, and I had to sit down because my legs would not hold me. Diana published her story. It ran as a 5-part series in the Washington Post, detailing the full scope of Ashford's operation. The article named every victim. It described every injustice. It won a Pulitzer. Diana called me the day the award was announced and said, "This was never my story, Margaret. It was yours." I told her she was wrong. It was Ryan's. The foundation came next. Sophie proposed it. She wanted to create an organization that would support artists who had been exploited, silenced, or erased by the industry. Ryan agreed. I agreed. We named it the Sullivan Resonance Project. Because resonance is what happens when a sound does not die. It vibrates. It sustains. It passes from one surface to another, growing stronger, reaching farther, refusing to disappear. We filed the paperwork on a Tuesday in January. The three of us sat at the kitchen table with coffee and documents and a notary named Gerald, who had no idea why the old woman across from him was crying. I was crying because the kitchen table was full again, because there were 3 coffee cups instead of 1, because the house smelled like breakfast and piano polish and the particular warmth that only exists when a family is together in the morning. Then one evening the phone rang. Sophie answered it. She listened for 30 seconds, set the phone down, and looked at us with an expression I will never forget. "Carnegie Hall," she said. "They won us. All 3 of us. 1 performance. Ryan's concerto." The room went still. Ryan looked at me. I looked at him, and somewhere in the space between us, in the silence that had once been a grave, and was now a beginning, I heard the echo of a young man's voice on a payphone 18 years ago. "Tomorrow, Mom. Carnegie Hall." Carnegie Hall smelled like old velvet and history. I had never been inside before, though I had imagined it 1,000 times. Every music teacher does. It is the room where sound becomes permanent, where notes played on a Tuesday evening in New York City echo in the memory of everyone who hears them for the rest of their lives. 2,800 seats arranged in 5 tiers of curved balconies, all facing a single stage. And on that stage, under warm golden light, sat the Steinway Concert Grand. Not Ashford's stolen instrument. A new one. Donated by the Steinway Foundation. After they learned the story, its lid was open, its strings gleaming, waiting. I stood backstage in a dark blue dress that Sophie had helped me choose. My hands were trembling, the way they always do before a performance, the way they have done since I was 9 years old and played my first recital at the Methodist Church on Abercorn Street. Some things never change. The fear never goes away. You simply learn to carry it to the bench and set it down beside you and play anyway. Ryan was beside me. He wore a black suit that fit him perfectly now. 4 months of physical therapy and morning runs along the river had rebuilt his frame. His shoulders were straight. His hands were steady. He looked like a man who had come back from somewhere very far away and was still learning to believe he had arrived. He stared at the stage through a gap in the curtain and said nothing. Sophie stood on his other side. She was 20 years old now, though she carried herself like someone older. Someone who had learned in a single night that everything she believed about her life was a construction built by a man in a prison cell. She had spent the past 4 months studying, composing, and sitting beside her father at the kitchen table in Savannah, learning to know him the way you learn a piece of music, measure by measure, phrase by phrase, until the whole thing begins to make sense. The 3 of us had rehearsed the concerto together every day for 6 weeks. Ryan played the main voice. Sophie played the secondary arrangements he had written for her, and I played the accompaniment, the simple left-hand foundation that held everything together. 3 generations at 1 piano. 3 sets of hands. 1 piece of music that had survived theft and imprisonment and silence and 18 years of darkness and had somehow found its way back into the light. A stagehand appeared and whispered, 2 minutes. Ryan turned to me. Do you remember what I said? On the phone. The night before the flight. You said, tomorrow, Mom. Carnegie Hall. He nodded slowly. I meant it. I just did not know it would take this long. I reached up and straightened his collar. The way I used to do when he was a boy and we were late for church. The music waited, I said. So did I. The house lights dimmed. 2,800 people fell silent. A voice over the speakers announced the program. A single performance. A world premiere of the complete concerto by Ryan Sullivan. Performed by the composer, his daughter Sophie Sullivan, and his mother Margaret Sullivan. We walked onto the stage together. The applause began the moment the audience saw us. 3 figures crossing the polished wood toward the piano, and it grew louder with each step. I did not look at the audience. I looked at the piano. I looked at the bench. I looked at my son and my granddaughter, and I thought about all the nights I had sat alone in an armchair with headphones, listening to a recording of this concerto, believing it was all I had left of him. I thought about the locked piano room and the brass key and the dust on the metronome. I thought about the empty coffin and the fake ring and the note that said paid in full. I thought about Diana Torres and her stolen laptop and her 5-part series and her Pulitzer. I thought about Elena Reyes opening a door at 2:32 in the morning. I thought about Tom Bradley standing in a cemetery in the rain, giving us 3 hours we did not deserve. I thought about room 7. A white room with no windows. An old upright piano with a cracked soundboard. And 2 dead keys. A man playing the same concerto every day for 18 years because the music was the only thing that could not be erased. We sat down. Ryan in the center. Sophie on his right. I on his left. 3 generations. 1 bench. 1 instrument. 1 story. Ryan placed his hands on the keys. I placed mine beside his. Sophie placed hers beside mine. For a moment we simply sat there. 6 hands resting on ivory, feeling the weight of everything that had brought us to this stage. The silence was not empty. It was full. It was the silence of a room holding its breath, waiting for the sound that would break it. Ryan played the first note. A single C. The same note that had begun the concerto when he wrote it at 16. The same note Sophie had played at the Ashford Gala. The same note that had echoed through room 7 for 18 years, bouncing off white walls and locked doors and the inside of a man's skull until it became the only thing he knew for certain was real. The melody unfolded. The first movement rose like a sunrise, gentle and uncertain and full of light. The second movement drove forward, with the urgency of a heartbeat. The third movement ached with a tenderness that made 2,800 people forget where they were. And the fourth movement, the hidden movement, the one that had carried a message across years and miles in silence, played out in full. No longer a code, no longer a cry for help, but a completed thought. A sentence that had taken 18 years to finish. The final chord rang through Carnegie Hall. Ryan held the sustain pedal down. The sound filled the room from floor to ceiling, from the orchestra to the highest balcony, vibrating in the wood and the velvet and the bones of every person present. It sustained for 10 seconds. 15. 20. Until it faded into a silence so profound that it felt like the room itself was breathing. No one moved. Then Ryan lifted his hands from the keys, turned to me and said, "We made it, Mom." The audience rose. 2,800 people stood at once, and the sound of their applause hit the stage like a wave. Sophie reached across the piano and took her father's hand. I put my arm around my son's shoulders and held him the way I had held him when he was 4 years old, sitting on my lap, pressing a single key, laughing at the sound it made. The applause continued. It continued for a long time, but I was not listening to the applause. I was listening to the silence between the last note and the first clap, that one perfect second when the concerto had ended and the world had not yet responded, that sliver of time when the music simply existed, complete, whole. needing nothing. That was the sound I had been waiting for. Not the applause, not the verdict, not the rescue or the arrest or the foundation or the headline. Just the music, finished at last, hanging in the air of the room where it was always meant to be played. I leaned over and whispered into Ryan's ear. Tomorrow came. He smiled. The first real smile I had seen on his face in 18 years. And it was enough. After everything, it was enough. If this story touched something inside you, consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel, because every story we tell here is a reminder that the people we love are never truly gone. They are simply waiting for us to find them. Thank you for listening.